possible by We Pete's Word, RealAg Radio, and FMC Preschool. FMC Preschool is a product-agnostic program designed to equip growers and agricultural professionals with the latest tools and insights for effective weed management. From herbicide science to resistance trends, we're here to help you grow smarter. Learn more at fmcpreschool.com.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Agronomists, the learnings from the yen. I am your host, Peter Johnson, this evening, my first time ever as host. And of course, our own Lindsay Smith, who generally hosts the Agronomists, is on a plane on her way to San Diego. So they had to find a poor host to fill in for her, and they picked on me. Of course, from the yen perspective, I see lots of chatter. Mark talking about it's not great weather for winter wheat here in Ontario. There's rain. There's not much snow in some areas. Other areas we have just tons of snow. People talking about snow mold. It's just winter time, and don't worry about it. Until we get to spring, we just assume that the winter wheat crop is going to be fine. And that's what we're going to talk about here tonight, the Yield Enhancement Network. We have two experts. Let's bring them in to talk about the yen this evening. Dennis Pennington from Michigan State University. Dennis, of course, is one of the lead researchers on the yen, helping to drive it forward, along with Joanna Fallings from the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness, and our own Gord Speckschneider from Ontario. Gord is a yen participant and one of those growers who just wants to learn more. So let's start with Dennis. Where are you tonight, and what's been happening with you in the yen today?
Well, I'm actually in Nashville, Tennessee right now. I flew in down here. We had a wrap-up meeting with our Kentucky growers today, and so we had a great discussion with them, and I actually fly out tomorrow to head for New Brunswick. So, yeah, and the talk about the weather, it was sunny and 68 degrees here today.
Wow, unbelievable. Yeah. And doing the yen wrap up in Kentucky. And by the way, it is the Great Lakes yen, correct?
Yes, it's a Great Lakes yen, but we have growers from kind of an expanding geography. We're pushing further south and even a little bit west too. So it's not just the Great Lakes states anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I didn't realize that Kentucky was a Great Lakes state, but perhaps I missed something there.
They believe they are, yes.
Geography.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right on. And also Gord Speckschneider. So Gord, where are you tonight, and what's happening for you this week?
I am joining from lovely Kingston, Ontario. We had our first day of meetings ahead of the Ontario Soil and Crop AGM, which is going to be tomorrow and the next day. Tomorrow is going to be mostly business, a little bit of cool stuff with a couple of different panels and some expert speakers. And the following day is a big deep dive into micronutrients, which is something that one of the many things I need to learn more about. Hopefully maybe we'll get into some of that tonight even. So thanks for having me. This is not something I would ever picture myself doing, especially talking about wheat with the two of you. I feel like a child among giants here. So we'll see what happens.
Oh no, you are the reason, Gord, that we do these things, is because if we're not helping farmers, then what the heck are we doing, right? And so for the people that don't know, Gord is a provincial director with Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association, and the MicroSmart Day on Wednesday has just an amazing program. I'm sure the Soil and Crop session tomorrow is amazing as well, but unfortunately I can't make it to MicroSmart because Dennis Pennington is dragging me to New Brunswick with him, and we'll be in New Brunswick talking to the New Brunswick growers about growing wheat.
I thought you were dragging me to New Brunswick with you. That's what I thought.
You guys should be dragging yourselves to Kingston, where you should be going.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, yeah, we should have maybe been doing that, but it's not the way it panned out. And by the way, just before we kick it off, Dennis, I understand you have a big event happening this weekend.
Yeah, actually, my daughter's getting married, so yeah, I ended up moving my flight back from New Brunswick a day just because everybody's worried if we have a snowstorm and flights get canceled. I kind of got to be back for my daughter's wedding, so that's on Saturday.
Yep.
Yeah, that
So,
wount go
well,
well.
congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
And we will make sure you get back somehow, right? We'll throw you in a car if we have to and say, hit the gas, buddy.
That's right.
Yep.
Okay, so let's get underway. And I love Dave Hooker. I wouldn't miss this episode in a million years, right? That's rich.
That's
Gosh, great to
excellent.
have you, Dave. So Dennis, I think most people know what the yen is, but just because there'll be people watching the recording tomorrow that might not, do you want to give us just a real quick rundown on what yen is and what we're trying to learn?
Sure. So the yen is like a farmer to farmer learning opportunity. There's three kind of components to it. There's a yield contest, and the goal is to try to implement some new practice or try something new on your farm that you haven't done to try to push those yields a little bit higher. The second part is a data collection. We collect a tremendous amount of data, soil samples, tissue samples, grain samples. We count yield components and whatnot, and then we compile that into a 30-some page report that gets sent back to each grower at the end of the season. And then the third component is networking, and that's the opportunity to get growers together and talk about the wheat production issues. What are they seeing on their farm? What have they tried? What worked? What didn't? And that kind of thing.
Yeah, and the networking is going to be really cool this June coming up, June 2025, because the Yen Group hopefully is going to have a tour to the UK where they really know how to grow big wheat, right? Tim Lamyman, 268 bushel per acre winter wheat in the UK, baby. Gord, are you anywhere close?
I'm getting there. I'm getting there. Not quite there yet, but
Yeah,
imagine, eh?
yeah.
Holy cow.
Gord, I don't think you're quite there. Maybe even if you use it on a per hectare basis, maybe like it's
That's right.
close, but we're not.
None of us
It's
are
not
there,
even. Yeah,
really.
that's right, man.
Yeah, I can't get there with my corn yield per acre, so
No
don't
kidding.
feel bad from that perspective, right? But it is a great project, as Dennis says, is really amazing because there are participants now from even Washington State, which gets to be on the other side of the continent. But there's been so much in terms of what growers have learned. And the other thing that is coming to yen, and we're going to talk a little bit, I think, about it tonight, is the yen dashboard. So, Gord, you've played with the yen dashboard. What is it, and how do you use it?
So it's really cool, and it's actually something that I was I was bugging Dennis and Joanna to see if they could put together because, as you said, there's people participating in Yen from all over the place, right? So not even just around the Great Lakes. There's different parts of Ontario. There's in Michigan and like you say Kentucky and wherever else. So the benchmarking of it is cool, but you get benchmarked against all of those participants, right? So what a dashboard can do and what you can do then is you can sort of slice and dice the data. So instead of benchmarking your result against everybody, which are in different geographies and different growing conditions, you can say, okay, I've done, well, we'll get into it later, but I've done kind of a crappy job here. So what are the other participants with a sandy soil, for example, doing? Right? And if you're still an outlier from that situation, you can really say, okay, I mean, it's not just because I have a sandy ground, it's because something else is going on. So that slicing and dicing to me really expands the capacity to analyze. And it's it's not the be all and end all of the answer that you get, but it does give you an idea of, maybe there's something going on, and you can't blame it on, well, that guy got 160 bushels because he's in southwestern Ontario and I'm not. And there's a lot more we can look at the data and really try to tease out what's going on in our own situation. Pretty cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, and the
Dennis, I think
goal
you got to
behind
be.
those yeah, the goal behind those is to put the data in growers' hands, and that's been our goal from the beginning. And we've got 4 years under our belt here now in the end, and so we're starting to streamline things a little bit. It's a lot of work to put this together, and we have an excellent team that does this. but we're finally now this year just getting to the point where we're able to do some of those things like these dashboards. And you're right, Gord, I think this will be a game changer for the way that growers will interact with the data, because it's their data ultimately. And and you can then decide what are the things you're interested in looking at, and you'll be able to slice and dice that data, so that you can learn something yourself that you can use on your farm. That's what's really cool about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I think the other, I mean, it's the dashboard is just happening. But if the dashboard had have happened earlier, we really probably didn't have a big enough data set to look at, to slice and dice it. But it's certainly not fair for Gord to compare his sandy soil to Mark Davis's heavy clay along the lake, even though you're not that far apart. The soils are totally different. And so this capability to slice and dice, is very, very neat stuff. And so let's dig into it, Gord. You're in the yen. Talk to us about what you're learning, or what you want to learn out of the process, and what you've learned so far.
Right. So as Dennis said, and you've said, you get this big report, right? It's full of data from all the samples you send in, and we've got soil tests, we've got tissue tests, all these kinds of things, all in the context of where you sit against everyone else, right? So the first page, it gives you the rankings of the yield, right? So number 1 is say 170, number 2 is 168, number 3, and then it gives you yours. And mine is, we might as well just come out and say it. I got 90, I got 97, right? So, and then
Jay, maybe go to slide 1, Jay. Go to, just because that'll help, right? No, okay. The other slide 1.
Yeah, the other slide 1. So yeah, you get this, right? So there's me, right? So there's 1, 2, 3, and then there's me, right? So you get a rank of, I ranked 155th out of I don't even know how many people were in that, but so nowhere near the top. So that's your first kind of blow to the ego, right? And then beside that, you see the rank, and what this is on this one on the right here, this is your yield potential. So there's an algorithm that suggests, based on your location, your soil type, and your weather in that season, what you maybe could have gotten had you done everything right. And some of them are getting way past their potential. The algorithm says you can get a certain amount, and they're getting 155%, 105%, and then there's me. So, right? So I got 54% of my yield. So the algorithm says I could have got 178 bushels per acre on that plot. And I'm thinking,
so we put this chart in the report just to show you where you are with everybody else. But you look at that 96, and I mean, that's not a terrible yield by itself.
Right.
It just, the fact is you got some really stiff competition that you're going up against. So, really what you want to be looking at is, that percent of yield potential. You're at 54%. Ideally, what you want to see year after year is you want to see that number creeping up. You want to get closer to what that potential is. You want to reduce that yield gap that you have on your farm.
And Dr. Josh Noselski and I did a session at the Eastern Ontario Crop Conference, and we presented this data as well, and went through this process. And he said too, the algorithm's not perfect. Maybe it doesn't do as good a job as it might in terms of water holding or things like that. So he said, don't get too hung up on the number. But as you say, Dennis, I mean, if the algorithm stays the way it is, I mean, if we can make that number start creeping up and do a little bit better moving forward, that's pretty cool. But yeah, it is a bit of a punch to the gut when you see these numbers, but then it gives you the impetus to try to figure out what's going on, right? So
sorry that I fell off the system there. My internet just calved, and so I'm back up. I hope I stay here. But you're talking about percent of potential, right, Gord?
That's right.
And so I mean, 155% can't be possible. Something has to be going on with that particular one. But 54%, we'd like to see it do better, correct?
Right. That's right.
Yep. So,
and like Dennis said too, I said it's a pretty sandy field, doesn't hold water that well, and 97's not a disaster. I mean, it's not terrible, but 178 would be nicer. So we start digging into what might be going on there.
Yeah. So from that perspective, Dennis, any thoughts? Where would you like to start with the discussion? Do we look at soil type first?
Yeah, so usually when I sit down with somebody in the report, the first thing I look at is their soil type because I don't know each farm. I don't know what your situation is. So I look at, what is your soil pH? What's your CEC? What's your soil organic matter? Just to kind of get a feel what your like soil test levels are. I mean, is there anything in the soil test that might indicate you could have a deficiency or that it's a key nutrient that we got to make sure in your fertilizer program you're addressing? So I usually start with kind of the nutrients, and then from there, I go into the tissue sampling. We have tissue sample data, nutrient analysis at the first node, and then again when the flag leaf is fully emerged. So that gives us kind of a mid-season feel. How are we doing? Is the crop taking up nutrients properly? But then really the ultimate test is what ends up in the grain. And it's the grain nutrient analysis where you really start to see, do I have deficiencies or not? You can use the other data to say, well, did it come in early in the season or late in the season? Could it be a soil issue, or is it, lack of fertilizer application, or was there some other, condition that's causing a nutrient deficiency? But that's where I start, is looking at the fertility program, the crop nutrition program for the farm, because usually we can find something there to talk about.
Right. But when you look at the things that really drive yield that you've learned out of the yen, right, Dennis? Biomass is one, but biomass is one where it's kind of, yeah, that makes perfect sense because the grain is only a percentage of the biomass. And if you don't have big biomass, you can't have big grain. And it's pretty tough for a grower to manage biomass other than trying to get the crop to grow as well as possible, which everybody is doing. But I think the other thing, Gord, isn't one of the things that has really jumped out at you in terms of where not only biomass, but I think heads per meter squared is one that we've really discovered in the yen is a big driver, and one that you haven't been at the upper end. So Jay, maybe if you can go to slide 3, and let's see if we can make any headway on heads per meter squared.
Right. And you're right. That's one of the first things that popped out at me, right? I looked at these box plots and looked for my outliers. So just to explain, the orange dashed line is where I sit. The green line is where the top 20% sit, right? So a little off the mark on where I should be. And we've been learning from you folks and others that number of heads per meter squared should be 700-ish, right? To be sort of in the top, to be in the game, I guess. And I'm at 572.
And when you look at the winners,
my first question. Yeah,
those winners are approaching 900 to 1,000 heads per meter squared. It's just a huge number of heads per meter squared that they're able to get, because the more heads, the more seeds you have. That is your yield right there. So this is one of the important things that you got to look at. But how do you get high head numbers? How do you achieve that? So that's the question. So your number at 572. Maybe you'd like to see that a little bit higher. So what does that mean? Does that mean you just got to go out and plant more seed?
Well, we started looking at everything, right? And first thing we looked at was planting date. Pete he's told us 1,000 times, right? You got to plant as close to your ideal date as you can. So our ideal date is September 20th. I got in at September 29th. I'm thinking, that's actually not too bad. But we started looking at the weather data. I pulled some weather data from a local station. And in those 9 days, it was a beautiful September, and we got 140 growing degree days in those 9 days. So had I planted on September 20th, I probably would have automatically been in the 700 plus, maybe even more, potentially getting another 15 bushels or something like that. So yeah, planting data, as we know, is a big one.
So Gord, explain how you're doing that math. So you're saying you put more seeds per acre out, or you're saying that the time that you would have those extra 9 days, you would have had more tillers. So basically more heads per seed that was planted.
Yeah.
So just before you go there, just give me 1 minute, because I want to just focus on this 1 second, because I think it's really important. This heads per meter squared number in most of the world with high yield wheat, they don't think they need as many heads per meter squared as we are finding here in North America. Our winners are getting 900 heads per meter squared, 1,000 heads per meter squared, like crazy numbers. The winners in the UK and in New Zealand, they're often at 650 heads per meter squared. So this in itself is a really interesting finding, I think. The differences between wheat production in North America versus the wheat production in the UK. And so if that is the driver, I think it's really, really important. And I don't know, Dennis, you look at that box plot, it looks like the highest number there was well over 1,000, because if you doubled Gord's 572, you'd be well over 1,000 heads, right? So like that, those are just huge numbers. And so Jay, just take us to slide 4 if you can, and that will help Gord then, because Dennis, you asked about seed population, but I don't think seed population does it, right, Gord?
That's right. Well, we did some rough calculations, right? So we planted 1.6 million, and we put in a number for germination and survival. So that gave us, and we did some counts, right? So we got about 1.7 heads per seed, and that got us to that 572. But had we planted earlier, we would have gotten maybe another tiller. So now all of a sudden we're at 2.7, and when that's automatically over 700 right there, right? So just in those 9 days would have made probably the difference.
Yeah, and so just flip to slide 5, Jay, and then Dennis talk about this, because man, this just is so incredibly important and amazing how this works.
Yeah, so on this slide, you can see these are the 140 GDDs that Gord mentioned between September 20th, which is his ideal seeding date, and then his actual planting date, which was September 29th. And that would have resulted in 1.4 more tillers per seed, or per seed planted, resulting in greater than 900 heads per meter squared, which is where you want to hit. That's kind of your target. And so the key is timing of planting. You gotta match your seeding rate with the timing of planting. If you can plant on time at your target date, you can generally back off your seeding rate and let the plant do the tillering, because the wheat plants will tiller out quite a bit. In fact, what we're seeing in our high yield growers is they are planting less seed per acre than the low yield growers. So, but it's a factor of, you got to be able to drive that final number of heads per meter squared. And one thing that sets us apart from the UK, yeah, they try to target that lower number of heads per meter squared, but their heads are almost twice the size. They have, 60 to 70 seeds per head in some of those winners that they have in the UK, where if you got that many spikelets and that many seeds per spikelet, you can get higher yield with less number of heads per unit area. So I think for them it's a combination of the genetics they have and the growing season they have, and like you said, Peter, in North America here, with the genetics we have and the time that we plant and the type of grain fill period we have, I think we're finding that hitting that 900 or greater heads per meter squared is the target that we need to be shooting for.
Right. And so I think Josh did these calculations, and so it's pretty clear that Josh is using 100 growing degree days for every tiller that develops, right? 140 growing degree days, and he got 1.4 tillers. And right. That's a pretty good number. It isn't always exact, but that's what he used for that. And Dave Hooker asked, this slide is, the picture there is not from a yen comparison. That picture, I believe, is actually from Emma Dielman's master's thesis that Dave Hooker was her advisor, and those are different planting dates. But I think what this really drives home is that there are no substitutes, right, Gord? You and I talked, if I can recall, about the time you were seeding your wheat on September the 29th, and we talked about seeding rate, and should you up the seeding rate? And it's kind of like, well, it's September. It's not really late. Besides which, in Dennis, your data, increasing seeding rate wouldn't recover that yield loss anyway, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And so we've got to be looking at other things too. I mean, you've got to be planted in the fall early enough so that you can get that tiller development. But then how you manage it in the spring, we always lose tillers between spring and harvest. And so we trying to manage that crop in a way that we lose less tillers, and we're able to keep the tillers that are produced, is pretty important. So in the picture there, that's a planting date difference, but that's huge. And I see Phil is putting some comments in about in-row phosphorus.
Yeah, and we will
Anything
get
you
to
can
them. We
do.
will get to them. Yeah, we will
Yeah.
get to them. We have data on there. So yeah. So just let's wrap this up. We're going to go to a read, and then after that we'll come back and carry on with the next step of this. But I do want to drive home the point that early planting, those 9 days in September, right, Gord? Do you think, oh, it's only 9 days?
Yeah.
That 9 days is all the difference, and there's no way to get it back. And
Yeah.
it's not rocket science that early planting pays, but man, this just drives home why it pays and why every day in September makes such a huge impact on the final outcome. So cool. With that, Jay, if you want to go to our first read, and then we'll come back and talk more about fertility.
Our sponsors of the Agronomists are FMC Preschool, Wheat Pete's Word, and RealAg Radio. Real Agriculture's RealAg Radio is Canada's only daily 1-hour agricultural radio show broadcast across North America on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. Hosted by Sean Haney, the show airs weekdays, 4:30 Eastern, across Canada and the U.S., and is rebroadcast the next day at 7 a.m. Listen live on Rural Radio Channel 147 or find it wherever you get your audio.
Okay, so we'll carry on, and there's some great comments and questions in the chat. So let's go right to the phosphorus discussion. And so Jay, if you want to go to slide 10, and by the way, the people asking about economics, we'll deal with economics towards the end. We absolutely have economic data. So hang on to your hat there. So sorry, Gord, tell us what you did from a phosphorus standpoint.
Okay, so this field is on one of the chicken farms, and it's had a legacy of, well, way too much chicken manure over the years. So our phosphorus levels are through the roof. We've been mining them down, but still very high. And the textbooks say at over 70, you're not going to get any phosphorus response with wheat. That's what I thought, anyways. So I didn't put any in the furrow. And then I was talking to Josh about that, and he pulls up some of the yen data of people or fields that had over 70 and still applying, at least some phosphorus in furrow. So I think, I probably missed the mark right there.
So a soil test of 97, I believe, right?
Mine's
was your soil
97.
test phosphorus? Yeah. I mean, that's so high. We should actually mine it and sell it as fertilizer.
Right? Yeah.
Right. And so this question, Dennis, what do you think? With that high of soil test phosphorus, should Gord still have applied phosphorus in furrow?
So, yeah, that's a really good question. And, it partly depends on planting timing. The earlier you're planting, you get a greater opportunity for uptake of phosphorus. Typically, research would probably say that with that high of soil test levels, you won't always get a response. And it turns into yield. You'll always be able to see a visual response in the field because you just get that rapid uptake early because that phosphorus, when you place it with a seed, it's right there available for uptake. So, you would not expect, maybe 1 in 10 years to see a response to putting phosphorus in the furrow when you have that high of soil test levels. But this begs the question of, all right, what else is going on in the soil and in the system? Are there other things that we need to be looking at? Is our phosphorus being tied up in any way? are we getting adequate root growth and those kind of things. So we got to bring all of those pieces of the puzzle, I guess, together before we can just give you a straight answer, yes or no.
That's
And
right.
and I
It starts
think
to become another. Go ahead. Yep.
no, go ahead, Gord.
I was just going to say. I mean, it starts to be a bit of a detective work, right? You're trying to find out what's going on. So yeah, there's things that come up in our later tests that suggest, well, maybe even though we have those high tests, we're not getting into the root.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think that was a great example of where the Yen dashboard, that last slide that we showed, where the Yen dashboard was able to isolate only growers with higher than 70 parts per million phosphorus soil tests. So we start to say, how is that playing out? And if you looked at that data, the high yield growers applied 39 pounds, the low yield growers applied 55 pounds. And so you wouldn't say necessarily that phosphorus in the row was the reason that gourd was in a lower yield category. On the other hand, when you look at what Phil's saying, what Dave's saying, you almost would say maybe a little bit gourd of starter phosphorus might be a worthwhile project to try.
It's definitely worth running some strips, right, on that field and see. Yep. It would surprise
Yeah.
me, but who knows? And it's the data suggests that it's worth a try. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
And I would concur with that. And that's part of why we do this program is to learn. And you got to be willing to do some test strips. That's going to be an investment of some time on your end, but I think that's the reason we do this is so that we can learn. What are the things that work for us on our farms and in our fields.
Yeah. And Brendan has the quintessential comment on phosphorus. And we're all talking about soil test phosphorus as if one number works for all soil types. And I'll tell you right now that it simply does not. So I get to Mark Davis's heavy clay, and if he has a soil test of 60 for phosphorus, he's still likely going to see a phosphorus boost. Or on heavy clays, because you get restricted root growth, you're more likely to see that phosphorus response. You get on the gorgeous silt loams of Oxford County, God's gift to Ontario, and you get such good root growth that even in, as Brendan says, fields with a 5 part per million soil test, you may not see response. Year in and year out, I think most agronomists would agree that it's one of those things that you should do because you probably will see response often enough to make it pay, but nothing works 100% of the time, right? And so, Dennis, there are some other things that come into play when we talk about these nutrients. And so, one of them certainly is magnesium and boron and some of the micronutrients. And gourd's pH is pretty high. So, do you want to, is that
Yeah.
something that you also think we should talk about?
Yeah. Let's put up that one slide that has the
Yeah, that's slide 11. Slide 11,
nutrient
please, Jay.
ranges. So with a pH of 7.5, Gord, that's what your pH is. I just put a line on these slides where pH 7.5 is. And the chart on the left that has the different colors on it, that's the availability of the nutrients. So you notice that as you go from left to right, you'll see the availability, the width of those things change. And when you're out at a pH of 7.5, the ones that I've highlighted in black there, iron, manganese, boron, and zinc, um, that's at the higher pHs when you start to see those become a little bit more deficient. And I saw in your box plots, whether it would be either the tissue samples or the grain sample, you could see a little bit of evidence that maybe you were ticking on the low side or possibly some deficiency. So with the pH of where you are, I think maybe we want to think about putting on some zinc, manganese, boron. Our growers on the other side of the lake, that have the high pHs like that, they're putting in a zinc, manganese, boron product as a with their nitrogen, and they're streaming that on. Some of them even do it at both nitrogen timings, but so yeah, I think the phosphorus is one of the issues. But I think we could also maybe see a little bit of benefit by looking at some of these micronutrients as well.
Would you suggest micronutrient application in the fall in that case, or are you just in spring?
Yeah, we don't generally have a lot of people putting fall micronutrients on. Usually the first micronutrient pass is when they're putting either their first pass of 28 on. Sometimes it'll go in with fungicide at a T1 timing, and then that will actually get sprayed on the leaves as opposed to streamed on. So yeah, it might be worth doing some strips in the field. Buy a jug of product and do some strips with and some without, and just test, see if you can find a response on your farm.
Yeah.
The other thing that came up in my conversation with Josh was magnesium.
Right. So before we go there though, Gord, because I don't want people to leave thinking, oh gosh, we got to put these micronutrients on every acre, because here in Ontario, like you talk about zinc, Dennis, we've done trials with mez, right? So there's zinc in mez on pH of 8.4 soils.
Wow.
And we've seen no response to the zinc. So these are things that we're looking at Gord's report. And I mean, that's what the end is all about, is to look at maybe where, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, like, it's things to try to see if we can't take 97 bushels and turn it into 105 or 110. And the calcium thing, so Gord, I just will say, your calcium level at 2975, I deal with farmers that have calcium parts per million at 6, 7, 8,000 parts per million calcium. And they have pHs of 7.5. And we don't have high soil tests. We do get good phosphorus response, but these are all things to look at and have a bit of a play with, as opposed to, like, it's a look at where could we go, not necessarily as that is the answer, right? Yen gives us a guideline for what to try.
Yeah, and that's why looking at that report is so important, because you can find a little bit of evidence that maybe there's opportunity for those nutrients that I circled there in that slide in your report. If your report showed fine, then no, that's not an area where we would expect to see a difference. But yeah, I would at least consider it based on the data in that report, and maybe you'd want to do some other testing. I mean, have you done any other testing on, like, tissue testing on other fields besides this in the past?
We have history of tests on that field and other fields as well. So yeah, boron often comes low, pretty much either low or just average. But I mean, I don't know about the boron test, but maybe Peter will comment on that one. We can see his face already. But zinc is always high. Manganese is usually good across the board.
Yeah, I guess the question I would ask is, do you have any history that you have potentially any of these micronutrients as a deficiency, or is this just a fluke, 1 year, one field, one scenario? So having a little bit more of that background would help to determine, is there any likelihood of seeing benefit here or not?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, and so we're going to break here for another read, if we could, because I want to get back to the magnesium. I think there's some cool magnesium data. I think we need to hit sulfur yet, and we still need to hit economics. So Jay, if we could go to our last read, and then we'll finish up with some other fun stuff that we've learned out of the Yen program.
The Agronomist is brought to you by FMC Preschool, RealAg Radio, and Wheat Pete's Word. Each Wednesday, Peter Wheat Pete Johnson answers your top agronomy questions in this dynamic podcast, covering soil health, cover crops, planting, herbicides, and much more. Have a question? Leave him a message at 1-888-746-3311, send him a tweet at Wheat Pete, or email him at pjohnson@realagriculture.com.
Yeah, for sure. Wheat Pete's Word had to sponsor the Yen session, man. Like, it's a must, baby. Gosh, good stuff. So there is manganese was or magnesium rather, was one of the things that Josh really pulled out. So Jay, if we could go to slide 12, please, because I think that's pretty interesting data. And so Dave Hooker, you did mention on that heads per meter squared that we didn't have an x-axis. We do have an x-axis here. It's way too small to read, but at least it's there. But Gord, just walk through the magnesium thought process.
Yeah, so this is another example of one of those outliers that jumped out at us, right? And I think I talked to you, maybe, this has come up before, and we've seen histories of tests before that suggest magnesium is low. And the conventional wisdom, I guess, says, yeah, you're not going to get a response from magnesium, right? But when we were at the Eastern Crop Conference, we brought this up, and someone in the audience said, well, in Northumberland and Victoria and Peterborough counties, magnesium levels are less than half the Ontario average. So that's interesting. I didn't even realize that. So there may be something there. And then there is some evidence Josh brought up that there's some trying to figure out what the critical levels might be in tissues. And we're just sort of around where some of those numbers are coming up, that 0.15, 0.13, 0.2, et cetera. So there's something to look at there, I think. And there may be some interactions with our high phosphorus as well. That's maybe making what little magnesium is there less available even so. So yeah, I feel like this is one we need to chase a bit.
Yeah,
Dennis,
so
comments?
this is a great example because you got your box plots there to look at. This is part of the reason why we do these. So it allows you to kind of quickly identify by looking at these where, is this something that you need to pay attention to and look at further down the road. These are not gospel. We know the variability in tissue sampling. In the Kentucky meeting today, they were asking me, I want to know cutoff values for if I get below a certain number, I need to go out and put on sulfur. And there's just so many things that affect tissue test levels. But when you see a low soil test and 2 tissue tests that are low, I would also want to bring in the grain test. See, is your grain test on the low end? But then say, okay, this is something to look at. And maybe it deserves further exploration to figure out, could this be a problem or something that might be limiting yield on your farm?
And really cool that this drives you into the field to take those tissue samples so that you know where you shake out. And so, Jay, if we could go to slide 13, please, because I think this is again where we're going to move the bar even further. And so Josh Naselski went back to the literature and kind of looked at this phosphorus magnesium relationship. And I wasn't even aware of this, Gord, but really cool that in Europe, there's some good data where they are starting to look at the magnesium to phosphorus ratio in the tissue. And so again, looking at fields, so pulling out of the dashboard, looking at fields that had similar soil test phosphorus and magnesium, and looking at that magnesium to phosphorus ratio. And Gord, you're at the bottom end of the scale, right? You have less magnesium in the tissue compared to the phosphorus. And yeah, just you look at that and say, wow, soil test magnesium of 100, over 100. So typically we would say if you're over 100, you shouldn't likely need more magnesium. It's not a red flag. If it was under 100, it would. It's close. But yeah, I don't know. Dennis, are you familiar with that work at all?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the ratios, but it's interesting to look at this. The other thing that I notice in this chart is the others, there's Gord listed on the top row, and then there's these farms 1 through 5 listed. The ones below him have significantly lower soil pH. And, there was one, I guess there's 2 farms that had a lower yield than what you did. But then there's, farms 3, 4, and 5 actually had, 113, 118, 125. But their pH is a little bit lower and their ratio is a little bit different. But, I think this is another reason why, you would have never known that this was going on in your farm had you not participated in the N and gone out and collected these samples. So another reason why being in the N is valuable is because it helps you to identify and see what's out in the field, and then we can start to dig into it and figure out, is this a problem or not, and then can we fix it.
That's right.
And
Yeah, and no one's saying this is the answer, but it does, like you say, give you a reason to look a little bit deeper into it, right?
Yeah,
well, and
for
I
sure.
love the fact that you have the lowest ratio, but your soil test magnesium is actually above the
Yeah.
other growers on that list, right? But
Yep.
you would still like to get 125 bushel per acre rather than 97 bushel per acre, right, Gord?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
Warren in the chat saying that he's put 50 of K-Mag in his wheat starter, and it's eliminated leaf striping and put his tissue tests above that critical level. So I think that's kind of cool as well. But lots to learn, and what we're learning is that there's lots of things we don't know from that perspective. So the other thing, Gord, in terms of your sulfur application, where was your sulfur application at? And if we could go to slide 14, please, Jay.
So yeah, we did a spring application pretty early on, and it was with ATS and UAN. So we had 15 pounds of sulfur on, and then we were
And
talking
Dennis?
that. Oh, go ahead.
No, sorry. So 15 pounds of sulfur as ammonium thiosulfate, or as dry ammonium sulfate, as ammonium
ATS.
thiosulfate.
Yep.
Yeah. And so we have, like, we're aware that ammonium thiosulfate doesn't bring as much available sulfate to the plant as dry ammonium sulfate would. But Dennis, look at those tissue samples. Would that raise a red flag from that standpoint?
Yeah, certainly those anything below the 25th percentile is something that we would want to look at. Now, you got to remember that this isn't research data. This is just reporting where you are in relation to everybody else. And the other thing is, I would look at where your line is compared to the green line too. Everybody wants to see, what are the high yield guys doing? How are they getting those high yields? That's what they want to look at. So yeah, no, I think with those. Your orange line where it's at, yes, I think it's worth looking at. And you said so you applied in the fall, your
Yeah,
sulfur in the fall?
in spring,
Oh, in the spring. Okay, all right.
but
So
but but fall sulfur did come up in conversation. Yeah,
okay,
I don't know if you were
so
going there or not, but
yeah,
Yeah.
we had a
No.
question today in the Kentucky yen about this, and does it if we put sulfur on in the fall, are we going to lose it? And it partly depends on soil temperature when you put it on and what form you put it on. If you're putting ammonium thiosulfate on, it's 50% elemental sulfur, which elemental sulfur has to be converted to sulfate in the soil, and you got to have warmer soils in order to do that. So likely you might not lose as much, but the key is getting the sulfur to the crop when the crop needs to take it up. And so you got to know when sulfur is needed in higher quantities. So sulfur uptake is similar to nitrogen. You got to have that, right at the beginning of stem extension, and that rapid uptake phase lasts through flag leaf toward flowering. And so, if you're putting it on in the spring, like say in a second pass of nitrogen, you might be missing your window, especially with those tissue test levels where they are. You might need to get it on earlier, and
yeah.
and
And
you might benefit from the sulfate version because you'll have the sulfate version is readily available to the plant, so you'll see a quicker response. But usually you'll see a little bit of like yellowing or kind of lime green color, not that good dark green color. That's a sign of a sulfur deficiency.
And
I
we didn't
do.
see anything like that, but as I said, the conversation in the crop conference was suggesting that on our sandy ground, relatively low organic matter, um, there's some people that are seeing a response to some false sulfur, and that's something I hadn't heard before. So they were suggesting put on some in the fall, put on the rest in the spring as sulfate, and maybe put mez in the furrow instead of MAP. So it was a pretty interesting conversation.
Yeah,
And they
and
were talking 15 bushel responses in some cases, which
and
was
so, Gord,
really
I
surprising.
think this is a great discussion, but you also have to put it in the context of last year, because
Mhm.
last year we had no winter, and the wheat greened up to 30 days ahead of normal. And so if you normally put your nitrogen and sulfur on the 20th of April, and you put it on the 20th of April in the spring of 2024, you were 30 days behind in terms of where the development of that crop was.
Right
And
on.
so I think that also plays. Now, I also, though, from this discussion, I really think that the climate has changed. The sulfur deposition has changed. We didn't used to get any response to sulfur at all. We're now starting to see on sandy soils like yours, the work that Sean Castile and even some of the work by Horst Bonner on really sandy soils with low organic matter. By the way, Gord, 2.6% organic matter on a sand is not low organic matter. That's a good
Right.
organic matter level for a sand soil. But we're seeing response on early planted soybeans because there's just no available sulfur for the plant when they're nodulating. And
Mm.
so in 2024 spring, early green up, later applied sulfur, I think that might have been, and would fall sulfur solve that? Man, I think if you put sulfur on this past fall, and all the snow that we've gotten,
Yeah.
now I got to be careful because not everybody's gotten that snow, but when that snow melts, if it's in the sulfate form, chances are that sulfur may well be leached out of the root zone, maybe not
Yeah.
leached out of the soil profile entirely,
Right.
but fall sulfur last fall may not respond like fall sulfur would have in the fall of 2023 for the 2024 crop. But this application of sulfur early in the spring, I think, is one of those things that we really are learning by going through this thought process, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, just
And
yeah. So
your comments really bring home again, right? That you have to always keep in mind the context of when you're listening to results from someone else or reading a paper or whatever it is. You have to dig into that, and then, like you say, this is maybe perhaps a special case. Maybe that case will happen more often, and it's something worth looking at again. But yeah, the context with which results are achieved is always an important thing to think about for sure.
yeah. And so I want to finish up here because we're going to run out of time, and there's still some great questions in the chat.
Yeah.
But there was a whole ton of discussion about economics. So, Jay, if we could go to slide 15, and we'll talk, just run us through these economics, Gord, because I think this is phenomenally interesting.
This was a surprise to me for sure. So these are numbers from some book value. So I mean, don't get too hung up on the numbers themselves. But so I spent $1.59 a bushel, got 97, and I thought, we're talking about some of these people that are getting really high yields, right? And you kind of think, oh well, they're just throwing the kitchen sink at this thing. They're spending tons of money. But you look at these numbers and geez, they're not spending much more per bushel than I was. But then you look at the returns, we just threw $7 in there as an illustrative example, but not spending that much more per bushel, but returning quite a bit more per acre, right? So that was an eye opener for me. I just thought, oh, I'm being more efficient. I'm going to be further ahead, but not by quite a long shot there.
And
Yeah,
Dennis, I think that holds true, right, for the whole program?
yeah, so we did. I see you did this for just yours, which is great. I'm glad to see you're doing that, because every grower in here should be calculating their own, input cost per bushel. But we did calculate. I see you got the top 20% column there. We did the bottom 20% and compared them.
Mm,
Yeah, and seeing similar differences there. We didn't calculate into actual dollar return per acre. We calculated it out to dollars per bushel.
mm,
And yeah, just a remarkable difference. I hear that all the time is, oh, well, you're a yield contest, so all your growers are just throwing the kitchen sink at it. They're not making any money. They're
yeah,
just wasting money on inputs, and that is not true. Um, the guys that are on top are getting the best use and efficiency out of the inputs that they make, and they're making strategic investments in inputs that are helping them to achieve it. And that comes from years of testing on the farm. You got to test these products and practices on your farm. If you don't, if you're too busy, you don't have time, uh, I don't know what to tell you, but that's you got to figure it out on your own farm, what works and what doesn't.
That's right. And one question that came up at the conference too was Chuck Baresh. He's a really smart guy, does math. He goes, I'm doing the math in my head here, and you spent $154 an acre on your inputs, whereas the top 20% was doing double that, 296, I think the number was. And he goes,
Yeah.
well, how do you deal with the sort of the emotional response to investing that much in, not without a guarantee that you're going to get those bushels back out, right? So that was an interesting conversation too. But I think the answer came out that these top growers, they're managing well. They kind of know their fields, they know their system, and they have some confidence that they're going to get most years
Well,
the response that they
in
expect, and it's worth the investment, right? Yeah.
Yeah, these high yield growers didn't just one day flip a switch and they went from 110 to 160.
What?
These are things that has taken them time, that they've slowly ratcheted up their yields over time. And so, you just got to start making some steps. And, by being in the end, you got some data in a report now that can help you try to identify what are some of them next steps that I can take. And you just got to climb the ladder, basically. It'll take
I
you
was hoping
time.
for that switch, but no, you got to climb that ladder. You're right.
Everybody wants to know the magic bullet. What's the magic answer? And there's not one, and it's not the same from farm to farm. So
That's right.
you just got to how to figure out how to manage the system that you have to the best of your ability, and try to take out anything that you can that limits yield.
And so, Dennis, just on that note, is it more nitrogen? Is that one of the main inputs? Is that what's driving yield, or does that not really shake out?
Well, yes and no. So yes, the guys that are getting higher yield are putting out more nitrogen. They're also taking up more nitrogen in the crop, because we calculate all of that. But when you look at the amount of nitrogen that they put out as far as fertilizer per bushel of yield that they get, they're much more efficient. But even within the N, our efficiency has a wide variability. The variability is huge. I just had a chart up today that Joanna and I created that it shows the uptake in the grain plus the straw, so the total cumulative. In your report, it's the top of page 17. It's the little table that shows you your NPK and S uptake, and you show that compared to grain yield, and you could see that result go up, or the trend go up. But the you circle those that are above 150 pounds of uptake, and there are people that are taking up 150 pounds of nitrogen that are getting 100 bushel yield, and taking up 150 pounds and getting 170 bushel yield. So it's a overall,
This
yes, the trend is you got to have more nitrogen, but there's a lot of variability in it.
Yeah, and so I just go back to one of the growers I worked with, Andy Timmerman's. One of his big learnings at the start of the yen, he was a 180-pound nitrogen guy, and he sort of learned that he didn't need that much. So you can go too far out that other side. But Dennis, I think a really important a point that you made is that typically high yield growers are much more nutrient use efficiency, certainly nitrogen use efficient, than low yield growers. And that's true across North America. And that's one of those messages that I do think we need to get out there. Doesn't mean you go to 180, because maybe that's overkill. but,
Yeah.
but yeah. So we just have a couple of minutes left. Jason in Manitoba is asking, what would be the advice to focus on for a spring wheat yen in Manitoba, North Dakota, Minnesota, and South Dakota?
What to focus on in terms of
How
creating
are
a
they going to
yen,
pull it
or
together? Yeah. How does that? I mean, it's
yeah,
no work,
so
right, Dennis? It's no work whatsoever.
oh, it's a lot of work. I baloney. I call BS. But I think the biggest thing, if you want to put together a spring wheat yen in Manitoba, is you got to get a team of people that have the time to dedicate to organizing a program like this, and putting it together. And then you got to get the growers interested to sign up and be part of it. And so I think the first step is you got to have your key resource people, the ones that can help answer these questions and be on these kind of calls, to talk about, what is the agronomy behind what we're doing. We have the system in place so we can collect the data and report it back to you. That's not a problem. I think you got to build a team that has time available to do this work and coordinate and organize it.
Yeah, and it is a ton of work. Gord, from a producer standpoint?
I was just wondering if Dennis was alluding to maybe doing one for corn and soy too. That'd be cool. Well, you're at it, right? You already got it all in place, so yeah.
Yeah, I got all the time in the world. Yeah, shoot, let's throw some canola in there, and what else? Some barley and rye, and yeah, let's just do it all. But
Yeah, I actually think
it would be cool to have, other crops included into here. In the end, it would be really nice to have like a complete crop rotation. So that we're collecting this data on the entire crop rotation. Then we might be able to start looking at some more complex, scenarios like the effect of cover crops and how does soil health play a role and things like that. So,
Yeah.
we're getting our feet wet with wheat here. We got 4 years of data under our belt now, and we're kind of off and running now.
Yeah. As usual, wheat leads the way.
I see. Yeah, right.
So
I do have one question. If we have a second, though,
sure,
Dennis, are you finding that the researchers are taking notice of this and saying, "Geez, this might be, informing where their next investigations might go"? I mean, I know we're not really making any answers or anything, but we're giving some clues of where things might go next, and maybe the researchers taking note of that, and maybe that helps them decide.
Yeah, that's a good comment. And, from an academic perspective, you would need to be set up as an experiment where you can do side-by-side trials. And we hear that all the time that, you report, what was the average yield with product one and what was the average yield without it. And you can't say that, that product caused the change in yield.
Right.
So from that perspective, academics question the validity of the data and what we do. However, I think that we get enough of us together and this database keeps on growing. I think we can identify areas where further research would be warranted. And if we're starting to see some trends and things, we can say, look, we need to invest in some research in this area to pinpoint, whatever that is. Maybe it's the sulfur for you is one of the questions you had, but I think it can be done here. And I think connecting these yens globally is important because there's yens scattered across the globe. And what's nice about that is the network piece of it where you can learn from each other. And, climates are different, but, and so we've talked about trying to pool data together for that purpose.
Yeah. And really cool stuff. And I think it's exactly what was in the chat. Both Phil Needham and Dr. Dave Hooker saying that the yen data is observational because they're not side-by-side replicated plots. But in terms of, do the researchers look at that and say, wow, that's interesting. Should we investigate that? I do think it can give some good guidance from that standpoint. By the way, I think the other great thing that yen does is it gets the producer in the field looking at the crop, not driving by at 50 miles an hour, 80 kilometers an hour and saying, gosh, that's good looking wheat. They actually walk in the field and they stick their head down in the canopy and they say, what is going on? Oh my gosh. So I really do think that there's some benefit there. And we will learn out of the tissue samples, out of the grain samples. And by the way, Dennis, I really do, as I said at the start, I think it's amazing that we've already learned how important head count is in the North American situation versus what seems to be head count in the UK or New Zealand. And that may even give our wheat breeders an indication that they should maybe be trying to breed for more fertility in the head to get more kernels per head so we don't need as many heads per square meter. Really, really great stuff, guys. Thank you so much for participating in The Agronomist. Dennis Pennington, Michigan State University, Gord Speckschneider, who is a yen participant from Central Ontario. Thank you to everybody who joined here tonight. They're great comments, questions in the
Awesome.
chat. By the way, Warren, anytime your potash level is higher than your magnesium level, you have a problem, my friend. That's an unstable soil. So yeah, I'm not surprised that you're running into some issues from that standpoint. Next week's agronomist is on outsmarting weeds by layering herbicides. Dr. Joe Ickley and Rachel Evans. We will see you next week. Thank you so much, everybody. Remember, if you missed today, you can always catch it as a podcast. Will be up on the Real Agriculture site tomorrow. Guys, thanks so much for a great session. Have yourselves a great night, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.